Hello guys, how is everyone today? I wanted to do a very unique video today involving history. Now I am warning everyone, this video has major spoilers for both Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2. If you did not finish both games and do not want spoilers, do not watch this video. Now onto the video. This is a historical video, and if this video becomes popular, I will do more in the future on the history of the West and how it relates to Red Dead. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like so I'll know. The Pinkertons are the main antagonists in Red Dead Redemption 2, and I think they are perfect for this role. Many people do not know who the Pinkertons are and have gotten confused. Who are they? What did they do? Many people think they are cops or they're law enforcement. They aren't cops, at least not technically. I have asked a lot of people if they know about the history of the Pinkertons, and not many do. The Pinkertons were a real group, and the same ones that are in Red Dead Redemption 2. They're not just based off them, they're the exact same group. The full name of the group is the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Who were they? What did they do in real life? The Pinkertons were formed in the year 1850 in the city of Chicago by Alan Pinkerton, a Scottish immigrant, in a partnership with Chicago lawyer Edward Rucker. They first formed the Northwestern Police Agency. Later it became Pinkerton & Co., and finally the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. If the Pinkertons are not government agents or cops, what are they? They are a large company with its own giant private police force. That's right, imagine a large company having its own police force. That's the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons formed during the Industrial Revolution, which was a great opportunity for them to grow. Companies were becoming larger and expanding, and they asked for security in protecting their investments. They additionally wanted to spy on their employees, which they had so many of. The Pinkertons started off being hired by numerous railroad companies in Chicago, where they solved many train robberies. They also grew tremendously during the American Civil War, where they served as spies on the Union side. They would infiltrate behind Confederate lines and gather information, as well as use civilian and military disguises to gather crucial information. Alan Pinkerton, the founder, has served as a spy himself. They became the most popular when they allegedly stopped an assassination plot against President Lincoln called the Baltimore Plot. However, it's debated whether the threat was real or not because nobody was ever indicted on the plot and there was only speculation. After the American Civil War, the Pinkertons grew more in larger cities, where they served under various large companies, mostly factory owners. The Pinkertons were not good people. At that time period, conditions in factories were very bad. Factories were very unsanitary, there was no proper ventilation, machines didn't have safeties on them, and the factories didn't even have fire exits. Children were working in factories, and people were working 6 days a week, and often long hours, up to 10 to 12 hours. And they would barely have enough money because their wages were so low. This is where the early workers' rights movement formed. Unions started forming and organizing, and many of these factory owners felt threatened by them. Instead of improving conditions in these factories for their workers and raising their wages, they saw it as a cheaper alternative to hire the Pinkertons to ruin the workers' rights movement. What did the Pinkertons do that was so bad? They would infiltrate unions and gather information on them and give it to the factory owners. They would gather names and get people fired from their jobs, but that wasn't the worst of it. During strikes, they would infiltrate the protests and try to incite riots. The reason they did this was to discredit the unions and the workers. The factory owners would then point to them and say, see, they are a bunch of violent rioters. They have no real legitimate grievances. They would also provide security for these factories, and their mere presence would incite violence of many workers. The Pinkertons would walk around armed like the mafia, and threaten and shake down workers. They would be the guys that would go up to you and intimidate you during a strike. They would threaten you and tell you to get back to work. And if you didn't listen, they would beat you up and brutalize you. They could even kill you, and nobody would be charged. They would get away with it. The Pinkertons had huge connections to the Ritz, city, governments, and local law enforcement. They seemed untouchable. However, one incident would finally change this. In mid-1892, the Homestead Strikes began. These strikes were against the Carnegie Steel Company, located in Homestead, Pennsylvania. This strike was organized by the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers Union. Even though the union represented one-fifth of the 3,800 workers, it had huge influence in leading it. The reason for the strike was that 3 years ago, the union got Carnegie to agree to the terms in their contract. The contract was set to expire on July 1st, 1892, and Carnegie gave orders to his operation manager, Frisk, to crush the union. Frisk started by cutting the workers' wages, and then he brought in new non-union workers. Then he locked the plant down and built a huge barbed wire fence around it with guard towers. This was all done in late June, before the contract was set to expire. They did not finish negotiating a new contract with the union, and they had all done this. Then it gets worse. One day after the union's union's contract expired, the company fired all 3,800 workers and brought in replacements. The workers were furious and stormed the plant and took it over. Now, where do the Pinkertons come into this? Frisk had hired the Pinkertons to retake the plant, and he brought in 300 Pinkerton agents armed with repeater rifles. You see where this is going. The Pinkertons tried to land by boat at night, but some of the strikers saw them and alerted the entire plant. Thousands of strikers appeared on the docks while the Pinkertons were still in the boats. Some of the strikers were armed as well, and then all hell broke loose. Both sides opened fire on each other. The Pinkertons fired into the crowd and killed 7 people, and the strikers shot back and killed 3 Pinkertons. It's unknown who opened fire first. There's 2 versions. John T. McCurry, a boatman for the Pinkertons, claimed the workers opened fire first, but the workers claimed the Pinkertons shot William Foy, a striker, first. The first 2 people wounded was the Pinkerton captain and William Foy, so it's very difficult to say exactly who opened fire first. What I will say is, even if the workers shot first, it's still the fault of the Pinkertons, because they should have never been there. You have people who have been abused for years, working in very poor conditions with very little pay, and they just got fired. Sending in the Pinkertons was a stupid idea, because the crowd was already on the brink of rioting. When they saw the Pinkertons, this pushed them over the edge. The Pinkertons were hired thugs, working for Carnegie and Frisk to enforce their will on the workers. Frisk and Carnegie are idiots for causing this mess. It would have been much simpler if they had just negotiated a new contract with the union, but instead, they thought it would be cheaper to hire thugs to scare and intimidate the workers into submission. The Homestead Strike became known as the Homestead Massacre. More strikers appeared at the docks shortly after the Pinkertons retreated back into the water by boat. The crowd then lit other boats on fire and pushed them towards the Pinkerton boats. Many of the Pinkertons were jumping off the boats and swimming away, and the Pinkerton captains threatened to shoot them if they ran away. Why were they in such a panic? Because these guys aren't experienced. The Pinkertons were able to grow their numbers because they hired in mass, and would generally hire anyone who signed up with them. That's how they got so big. But many people who are watching this video are probably wondering, did the Pinkertons really have as many men as they do in Red Dead Redemption 2? Oh yes, they would. The Pinkertons had a total of 32,000 men, 2,000 detectives, and 30,000 men in reserve. They had more men than the United States Army. That's how big they got. The Homestead Strike ended when the Pinkerton agents ended up surrendering to the strikers. Huey O'Donnell, one of the leaders of the strike, offered the Pinkertons to Sheriff McCleary if the Pinkertons were charged with murder. The sheriff agreed to the demands, and they were marched out of town on the condition that they disarmed. And while they were marching through the town, they got assaulted by many workers. The media here misled people by claiming the workers were beating up Pinkerton agents, but they didn't tell the whole story, especially about the boat landing. Unfortunately, though, no Pinkerton agents were charged with murder. No one was actually charged with anything. Eventually, the Pennsylvania State Militia retook the plant, and thousands of workers were arrested and charged with murder. The union, in response, charged executives with murder. Both the workers and the executives had to post a $10,000 bond, but the executives didn't have to spend any time in jail. This action by the Pinkertons could not be ignored anymore, and signified their downfall. For many years, you had Pinkerton agents beat up people, scare them, and violate their privacy. They would even occasionally kill someone at these brawls, and they would get away with it. Here, this was not ignorable any longer. Even though no Pinkerton agents were charged, the public was outraged. They were absolutely outraged. Here you had an actual massacre. 300 agents armed with Winchester rifles storming a plant. Many people were furious and did not understand how a private company had this much power. These guys weren't cops and were allowed to act like them. Due to public outrage, many states passed anti-Pinkerton laws. The state of Ohio even banned them permanently from the state. The Pinkertons were despised by the public. If they were so hated, why did they have so many agents? It's simple. Like I said earlier, they would hire in mass, and it was very easy to get a job with them, and they paid very well. Why would someone want to work 6 days a week in a factory with very little pay, when instead they could be a Pinkerton? Now here's the big question. What on earth are these guys doing in the West? Did they actually operate in the West? They did, and it's believable they would go after a gang like Dutch Vanderlands. The Pinkertons already had some operations in the Wild West. Banks and railroad companies would hire them to track outlaws that robbed them. In 1874, the Pinkertons went after famous outlaw Jesse James. They came in contact with Jesse James' mother and sieged her home. Jesse James was not there, and the Pinkertons were furious. The only people there was Jesse James' mother, Zerelda, and Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother, Samuel. One of the Pinkerton agents then threw an explosive device through the window, most likely dynamite, and blew off Zerelda's arm and killed 8-year-old Samuel. They most likely did this to draw Jesse James out, but it backfired, as the public was so outraged they killed a child that they had to call off their hunt. This is what Arthur means when he tells Dutch in chapter 6 to let the women and the children go, because when the Pinkertons come here, they will kill everyone, and they most likely would. A police officer can't harm the family of a criminal. You can't do that. But the Pinkertons, they weren't police officers. They were a private company who had its own army of thugs. They did not have to follow the same standards as cops would. Despite Alan Pinkerton criticizing slavery, the Pinkertons were hired by the Spanish government to suppress a rebellion in 1872 in Cuba that wanted to end slavery. That's how these guys were. They didn't care how immoral the job was as long as they got paid. Thankfully, there was some action taken against them. In 1893, the Anti-Pinkerton Act was passed, and this was a direct response to the public's outrage over the Homestead Strikes. This act banned the United States federal government and the District of Columbia from ever hiring the Pinkertons. This is 6 years before the events of Red Dead Redemption 2. The Pinkertons started losing money and business and went to the West to look for work, where they started being hired by banks and railroads. Not only this, but much of the territory in Western America in 1899 were newly admitted states, or they didn't even have states at the time. They had very little restriction and regulation on the Pinkertons, and this was a perfect area for them to thrive in. They are hired by Cornwall in the game after his train robbery, and the town of Blackwater after the failed heist to find the Vanderlyn gang. Even though the Pinkertons were banned from federal work, there was loopholes in the law. The law states in text that the federal government will not hire Pinkertons, but it does not state that they cannot be hired by local town governments and state governments, and this was separate from the federal level. Agent Milton, the leader of the Pinkertons in Red Dead Redemption 2, he represents a typical Pinkerton agent, arrogant, intimidating, and working for the elites, notably Leviticus Cornwall, who is most likely a parody of Andrew Carnegie. Now, probably everyone wants to know, what happened to the Pinkertons? Once the federal government became stronger, newer technologies allowed it to have greater control over its land. The rise of the FBI and more powerful law enforcement diminished their roles. They stopped taking the roles of cops for hire and became more of a security company. The company became much smaller over the years, losing its huge numbers. In 1960, they took detective out of their company name and were just known as the Pinkerton Company. But here's the thing, the Pinkertons, they still exist today. In 1999, they were purchased by Securitras AB, a Swedish security company, and became a branch of theirs. They do not have the same manpower and political power that they did in 1899 and are only security guards today. The Pinkertons are a very important part of American history, and they should serve as a lesson. There are some people today that say the police should be privatized and that you will save taxpayer money. I'm not saying a public police force is perfect. You are always going to have some bad cops. But with a public police force, there's more accountability. Your tax dollars directly fund them. But with a company like the Pinkertons, where is the accountability? They are private. While we have incidents of police misconduct today, with the Pinkertons, this is on a large scale. If the police were privatized, you would have a disaster like the Pinkertons. It's been done before, and it was a massive failure. Would you want a large company being your police? I wouldn't want that. That would scare me. A public police force is meant for law and order, equality under the law for everyone, but the Pinkertons were a police for profit. Money was their main goal, and law and order was second. Who's to say that everyone is equal under the law under their system? Agent Milton calls the Dutch gang savages. I'm not saying the Vanderlyn gang are saints, but based on everything I have told you about the Pinkertons, who are the real savages? I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I love history, and I am really good at it. I noticed a lot of people, they were talking about the Pinkertons, they didn't know much about them. I thought this video would clear it up. They didn't know who they were or what they did. Many people I talked to thought they were cops and they weren't. We should be very grateful the Pinkertons of 1899 do not exist today. I hope this video helped people understand them better, and I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this video, drop a like. If you're new to my channel and enjoy my content, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care, everyone.